afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, 5 Enterprise Parcel Transportation Trends that will help you ship better and save money in 2018. My name is Amanda Armendariz, and I am the editor of Parcel Media. Before I introduce our speakers, I first of all want to extend a huge thank you to both PureBridge and Logistics Technologies for sponsoring this webinar today and making it completely complimentary for our audience. I also want to remind you that at the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A, so please feel free to submit questions at any point during the next hour, and we will get to as many as possible at the end of the webinar. If you have a technical question you can't hear or something's not showing up for you, please submit a question in that same box, and a member of our technical staff will be able to assist you with that. Also, this webinar is available for a full 12 months after the presentation date, so you can access it via the same link you used to log in today. So if you want to refer back to it or forward it to a colleague, it's all via that same link, and it will be available for the next year. All right, so now I'm going to just give a quick intro for our speakers. Bob Malley is the CEO at PureBridge, Inc., and he has a 29-year track record of innovation and leadership in the TMS software industry. Ken Fleming is the Chief Operating Officer of Logistics Technologies, where he oversees product and service enhancements and innovation and leads teams in charge of marketing and product development. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Bob and Ken, and they will take it from there.
Thanks so much. I think we'll just get started with kind of the elephant in the room when you think in terms of transportation cost reductions, and that is Amazon. You can argue that the Amazon effect directly or indirectly affects every business, whether you're a retailer, manufacturer, e-commerce merchant, a carrier, or an infrastructure provider. As Jeff Bezos says, your margin is my margin. Your margin is my opportunity. So if you're anywhere near e-commerce, the challenge is how to protect yourself against the Amazon effect. So here we see some data points that really kind of floored me when I first investigated it. And that is 43% of all e-commerce runs through Amazon. eBay is around 7%, Apple is around 4%. And they account for the majority of all e-commerce growth year on year. Prime subscribers are at about 60 million, others put it closer to 90, which if you consider the U.S. population, that's about 40% of the population over 18 years old, or about 70% of the households, which is about 126 million households. It'd be an understatement to say Prime is influential in setting up free shipping as the new normal. And if you look at it based on Amazon's annual reports, where they report about $135 billion in revenue, $16 billion represents their shipping costs, or about 12% of revenue. Now, most other companies, their distribution costs are well over 20%, and for smaller e-merchants, as high as 35%. 2,000 lockers, 2.3 million deliveries out of their local facilities. Citigroup says USPS loses about $1.50 on every Sunday delivery. So even with all those advantages, they still lose about $7 billion a year in shipping. So it brings to mind how will other e-commerce companies defend themselves if they can't afford to absorb similar losses. Ken?
Thanks, Bob. So one of the trend drivers that I get to introduce to the group today is about landed cost of goods sold. Now, to introduce this, it really is pretty simple formula, as you can see on the screens. But reducing the distribution costs is a key strategy when you look at most organizations focused on increasing their profit margins. Now, this simple formula, if you look at the cost of manufacturing and add to it the cost of distribution, you actually get the answer of saying it equals to the total landed cost of goods sold. Seems pretty simple. And companies were first focused on reducing as much as possible, the cost of manufacturing through outsourcing production. And we've got to a point now that production costs have hit an all-time low, and therefore companies have shifted their focus into looking at the cost of distribution as a new method of focusing on how to increase their profit. So if you like, now as a result of this focus, reducing freight spend is key to organizations. Bob?
Yeah, and if you look at freight spend, it's the first time CSCMP broke out Parcel last year as part of their State of Logistics report, and it showed that Parcel is growing by 10 times the rate of all other freight modes, which means there's been a shift to smaller, more frequent shipments, and that's really parallels the growth of e-commerce, which is tracking at about the same rate. And it's not just domestic, it's tracking globally in a very similar manner. Ken, you probably have a perspective on how that trend is working globally.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. When I look at cross-border traffic and the drivers here, I love looking at this chart and thinking of it as the new modern spice routes. And as you can see here, you kind of look at it from a couple of perspectives. First, e-commerce and parcel delivery are global, and it's causing friction at cross-border points. The trend will increase as China and other economies start to engage in cross-border shipments, and merchants have to be cognizant of that landed cost that I was talking about earlier. Now, what I also find interesting is if you look at these spice routes and you take a look at the worldwide parcel spend, you could easily interpret this to be a little different, in that China here is clearly leading number one, and obviously by the amount of products that we are sourcing from that market, it would make sense. But if you look at, where the USA is now number 3, but if you actually look at it and combine the EU countries that are represented just on this chart, they combined represent 20% with only the primary countries listed, which makes them the second largest market behind China. Now, why this becomes important for us to recognize when we're looking at cross-border shipping is that entire EU market with respect to delivering goods from any country within the EU is now becoming more and more transparent. The one thing we didn't state at the beginning was that I reside in the Netherlands, and no matter which country that I'm shipping from, if I order a product off of Amazon Germany, it's now making it to my home in the Netherlands in less than 24 hours. Right? So when we take a look at the kind of volumes that we're expecting to see in different markets, I think we really should look at the US, China, and Europe as a whole as being the big 3 major players in these routes. Now, if we actually now start to focus on these key trends, Bob and I'd like to start talking to you about first the Omni-Channel delivery model. So the first of the trends, I basically hope that most of you understand or have some background in the base principles of Omni-Channel and that they're clearly understood. But I'm going to review it from an industry perspective covering both retail and manufacturing trends. Bob and I kind of joked about this particular slide when you try to reflect how the images here represent each of the age groups and which one we fit into. But if we look at this, millennial shopping habits are changing the way that goods are purchased. And you can see how much it's changed from generation to generation. And it's having a profound effect on distribution. One of the things that we'll talk about and that's very visible to us is the fact that you're seeing a change in the footprint of the shopping mall, where we've gone from the point of their thriving to the point that we predicted their demise, and now we're predicting the return of the shopping mall, but they're based on experience centers, where the millennials are going to the malls to gain experiences where they can feel the products, look at the products, communicate and speak with people and compare on the products, but the purchasing decisions are still being done over e-commerce. If we focus directly on the retail model, you'll see in this graph that we've provided is it really talks about the ability to fulfill from any location, and in particular what we're looking to is the location that's closest to the consumer. So when I think of this, I'm talking about it's either driven by the reducing of cost of distribution, as we previously highlighted, or due to the competitive pressure that we saw from Amazon. But the decision on which location is the ideal fulfillment location, or the closest to consumer, is the concept behind Omni-Channel. Right? In the old days of shipping in bulk to a distribution center, and from there to replenish store inventory, those are over. As Amazon builds its fulfillment centers closer to their customers, retailers are scrambling to do the same, and using stores as mini distribution centers, shipping directly from the store. More and more retailers and e-commerce merchants are drop shipping directly from suppliers, including Amazon itself. The challenge is that most WMS, OMS, and TMS systems haven't been architected to handle this new paradigm. And although companies like Manhattan, JDA, and IBM are now offering ship-from-store software to help retailers compete. In the logistics case, we formed partnerships with the likes of Manhattan and JDA to enable the ship-from-store parcel capabilities. So the key question is, how do you reduce the costs without compromising delivery? Now, Bob, in your case, your company's got a great story on retailers and ship-from-store. Can you give us a little insight?
Yeah, we're working with several retailers who are, really viewing stores as mini distribution centers as a new phenomenon. So many are trying to find a way to guide clerks through the fulfillment process using things like cartonization to tell them exactly which containers to use, how to pack them, how to ship them, with a personnel that may not be trained up on, the fine points of logistics. Which is why Deloitte in a 2017 study said that 59% of all retailers surveyed said that Omni-Channel fulfillment was somewhat challenging or challenging. They're just not used to it.
Now, I think one of the other things we could add, Bob, here is we could almost put an independent trend up with respect to returns, right? Because of the way that there's kind of two things that we see here, right? One is returns is a key part of the customer experience and ensuring that through this whole new shopping model that integrating a returns process to be able to allow the customer to be able to put the goods that they don't want back into the market as quickly as possible. But also we could take a look at it as the key part of a waste management program or CO2 reduction. Now I've actually seen and spoke with companies where picking up the packaging associated with parcel shipping is actually a benefit to companies that utilize the materials repeatedly in their supply chain. So if I speak of Kimberly-Clark, for example, they've got a program where after delivery to major stores, they're collecting all the paper waste from the stores in order to feed it back into the recycled product program. And carriers, we know, are doing the same with respect to recreating cartons using recycled materials. And Bob, one of the things that you and I were talking about recently is that you had made a calculation that you had done in measuring waste created by last mile delivery from a different perspective.
Yeah, if you think of trucks pulling up to your home, big trucks delivering tiny little items and packages, and the CO2 that they, spew in that process, I asked our engineers, calculate what the weight of all that CO2 is, and they did. And they revealed an inconvenient truth that last mile deliveries account for about 9 million tons of CO2 every year. To give you a perspective on what, 9 million tons is like, it's the equivalent of a pyramid of Giza every year going up into the atmosphere. So the more efficient you can make last mile delivery or minimize it, the better for the environment.
So when talking about manufacturing, if we shift to the manufacturing side of things, we're seeing the same kinds of things. It's not limited to retail, right? And manufacturers are looking to eliminate aggregation points such as data centers. As DCs. Excuse me, apologies. You can tell I'm a techie. If I give you an example with respect to what we're seeing in manufacturing, I've got two examples to talk about here. First, as noted before, manufacturers are looking at distribution costs as a major COGS factor. There's likely, for example, if I talk about automotive, we believe that you'll see likely more change in the automotive industry in the next 5 years than you'll see in the last 50. And it's not just in the design of the automobiles moving towards electric vehicles. Right? Financial models inevitably shift as the supply chain addresses the increasing demands of the consumer and the inevitability of automation. There's an example that I can share with you on the next slide with respect to Castrol and Bosch that are both cutting out the middleman in the specialist auto parts distributors in particular and want to supply consumers directly with discounted products that then retain the margin currently enjoyed by the specialist auto parts distributors. And both eBay and Amazon have already both signed agreements with OEMs to provide e-commerce supply chains to allow them to do that. Their key goal for them is to gain access to the consumer information to have better insight as to what's going on in their market rather than what's interpreted through the specialty parts distributors. And we'll talk more about the data part of it in a moment. The second example I have with Omni-Channel is one that's quickly becoming stronger in the manufacturing space, which is around 3D print and ship. Now, distribution is all about moving atoms, right? And three-dimensional printing promises to provide a means of creating product much, much closer to the consumer. And I've got two examples that I've actually seen myself in production in test environments. And that's one where I never thought I'd see the day, but Nike's actually printing shoes. And the concept of licensing a print file to the consumer, where you're actually going to buy the print file, bring it to a local producer, and have that product printed directly much, much closer to your home. And the second is with Electrolux, who are printing parts for engineers and repair centers. And the whole idea here is to reduce inventory on hand and ultimately the cost of distribution by having the parts produced much, much closer to those engineers or repair centers. And Bob, over to you to talk about the next trend.
The other trend we're seeing is the development of pickup sites, where the idea is rather than do last mile delivery, which is expensive, inefficient in terms of consolidated delivery and ecologically wasteful, as we described, models are emerging that mitigate these issues with customer pickup. Now, this is especially helpful for urban consumers where drop-off at apartments pose a security and storage issue, particularly with porch pirates on the prowl. I know that in New York City, apartment owners have been pushing back on the flood of shipments that they received during the holidays. So FedEx hold location, UPS access point are good examples of using their store locations to encourage pickup. So during the shopping cart checkout process, merchants are able to provide consumers with the choice to opt in to pick up shipments rather than receiving them at home. Of course, FedEx has a deal with Walmart that they announced last year, which has been going quite well. And Amazon has 2,000 lockers deployed in 50 cities. So, and always one-upping, Amazon is experimenting with delivery into your car trunks, particularly in the grocery sector. So the benefits of this are, it's greener, shipping costs are lower for sellers, deliveries are more profitable for carriers, it's more convenient, and it's more secure. So Omni-Channel is probably augmented by the growth of more carrier services. They're more than ever now. Back in the day when I first started, where we developed Clippership, it was UPS and FedEx as the duopoly that reigned. But now, the contract drivers that Amazon uses, there's the emergence of regional carriers, TaskRabbit, UberRush, crowdsourced deliveries more common than ever. And the primary driver being e-commerce, of course. So Amazon is taking steps to increase their footprint to get closer to their clients, closer to their customers for same-day and Sunday delivery. This is a real challenge for anybody who has to follow suit. The LTL market is also expanding in terms of last mile. So inside the industry, larger than Parcel, LTP, as if we needed another acronym, is becoming more common. Most freight companies now have a white glove division.
Now, Bob, one of the things I could highlight here for you is that, living in the Netherlands, I've shared with you a situation where the LTL providers, that LTP acronym that you just mentioned with respect to larger than Parcel, is required because many of the standard parcel providers can't deliver large boxes. And I can tell you over the last year, I've had to, actually at Christmas time, I bought the family a new ping pong table, and the LTL provider came to my house, unpacked the whole thing, built it for me in my garage, and set up the whole thing and taking all the packaging away. So I think one of the things that we know here now is that the drivers themselves are having to maintain both hard and soft skills with respect to home delivery. I had the same thing this year when I'd ordered my new bicycles for my kids off the internet, and they came and actually built the bicycle on site and then took away everything. So it makes it much, much easier for the consumer. It was included in the price of the product, and much, much easier for me than rather than going out to the stores and shopping. So I agree with you. We're seeing these trends, and they're actually executing in markets, and in particular in Europe, we're seeing a lot of that LTP.
Yeah, and drone delivery isn't without its issues. The FAA has been a constant source of frustration for Amazon. they're putting rules and regulations in place that won't allow a drone delivery out of line of sight from the drone controller, which kind of defeats the purpose of last mile. Of course, distance is an issue. My wife got me a drone for my birthday last year, but I was surprised to find how little battery life there is available to fly these things, and particularly if you're expected to haul a package up to 5 pounds around, which is really what Amazon is aiming for. This suggests that they'll have to be launched from platforms that are relatively close to the delivery point, or from blimps is one of the ideas. And docking sites, where do you keep them? How do you replenish them? How do you recharge the drones? All of that. And of course, Patent Office has issued more than 64 patents, including self-destructing drones. Not sure what that's all about. Drones that charge electric vehicles, methods for air-to-ground transfer, such as parachutes. So these are all intellectual property protections that could really put a moat around Amazon Air, giving them yet another advantage for what they're aiming for is half-hour delivery. So lastly, asset protection. I was saying to Ken that I read that Goodyear blimps get shot at between 20 and 80 times a year from the ground. So you can imagine what the little drones are going to put up with in the course of things. So the next trend we wanted to talk about is cartonization. And this really has to do with how the demand for parcel and the need for carriers to optimize their space utilization on vehicles, how do we make sure that that's a win-win for all users? I don't know if anybody remembers this headline, but Fred Smith, chairman of FedEx, was famous for a rant during a quarterly investor meeting where he just said, companies are using us like a utility. Like they just expect to have us available, and yet they're doing a very bad job packing items, which are causing us to cube out, meaning reach our capacity before we reach our weight capacity. So they kind of fought back, not just UPS and FedEx, although they fought back the hardest, but last year LTL carrier ABF put together a space-based rating scheme, which really did the same thing. Essentially applied a dimensional weight tax to shippers who didn't make good use of space. So kind of for those of you who don't know how DIM fees work, it's really taking the larger of a DIM weight or actual weight and using that as the basis for rating a shipment. So you can see, in this case, the DIM weight is 83 pounds, the actual weight is 39, but you can also see as the DIM factors have decreased over the years, it's resulted in more incidences where you're really more likely to be dimmed. So this container would have yielded a DIM weight of 59 pounds just a few years ago. Now it's 83. So that's resulting in more expenditures at a time when shipping costs are obviously on the rise. Now it's not all bad news for the carriers. In this case, the DIM weight adjustment resulted in a $100 million windfall for FedEx. Now you could say, well, that was revenue that they should have gotten anyway. But for shippers, it's meant that you're more likely to pay money if you're not more careful, packing, having controlled packing. And this really is an issue in two areas. One is where you're trying to estimate what the cost of a shipment will be, because you want to charge your customer for those shipping charges. And if you guess too high, you might lose the customer. If you guess too low, you lose margin. So a more systematic approach is really needed. So cartonization uses algorithms in much the same way video games use algorithms to determine how items are packed in space or how they're manipulated in space, a virtual space. So the way this works is Cartonization is an engine, and into the engine you feed requests, and those requests contain a description of all the SKUs, dimensions of the available containers, the dim rates, and other rates of carriers, plus rules like percentage fill, don't pack with. And what cartonization engines do in probably less than 10 milliseconds is figure out what the most cost-effective way of packing those items are. So in this case, this particular shipment, uncartonized, without the benefit of the algorithms applied, would have cost $20.50. Cartonized, it figured out, okay, you need to put this in a smaller container, and with that came savings. Now, it can also work in reverse. If you use too many small containers, you incur a minimum charge per container, which could cause you to, incur more cost for that shipment. One of the strategies you can use is to rate shop dim rates, because carriers such as USPS don't charge dimensional rates for shipments going to zones 1 through 4. So why not use them? Cartonization can take that into account. Ken, analytics?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. The next trend we're talking about is analytics. And many times I get asked about what's our take on not just this trend, but the next one that Bob will address. When we take a look at analytics, what we're seeing is that most parcel shippers don't have a good handle on their transportation costs, and that's because their shipping data is locked up in silos. Carrier-provided systems, third-party point solutions, audited invoice services that actually collect all the data, but make it impossible to analyze in a comprehensive way. And this is exacerbated by the lack of data standards in the parcel industry, unlike what we've seen with freight, which was once highly regulated. So with Omni-Channel strategies driving execution to more points of shipping, the need to provide management with an enterprise view of parcel data has never been greater, especially if the goals are to save in transportation costs as a cost of goods sold. So in the next slide, we've highlighted analytics as an evolution within how we're processing data and what we hope to achieve from it. And at the very beginning, where you're looking at value and difficulty, when you collect what we'd call data in its infancy, you would see what we're able to do is descriptive analytics. So on-time delivery in full, what's the performance of a carrier, what are my total costs? And you start to move up when, why did it happen? So you get into diagnostic analytics. Then what will happen from predictive? So if my costs of shipping rise by 10% next year, how is that going to impact my total shipment platform? Right through to prescriptive analytics, which will be defined as how we can make it happen. And that's being much more reactionary to trends that will be occurring in the market. So to do this, what we know we have to do is become much more cognizant in the way that we're not just capturing our data, but the way that we're measuring it and the tools by which we use to analyze it in order to create what we would refer to as a proper analytics platform to help make better decisions for our businesses. And Bob, that last big trend we've been talking about?
Yeah, the last big trend is really an emerging trend that I guess you could say blockchain is a supply chain technology in search of a problem to solve. But many people believe it is years away, and other people think that people who believe that are Luddites. But there are pilots underway, and the most notable is with IBM and Maersk. They really put a lot of time and effort into it. So I guess the first question is, what is blockchain? For those of you who haven't really come across it, you've probably come across Bitcoin, which blockchain is really the substrate on which Bitcoin works. But to define it, you could define it as a digital ledger, kind of a database, but it connects digitally in a network kind of environment, a chain of transaction records together, kind of a tamper-proof, they say immutable, encrypted, and secure manner. So in the same way that the internet has transformed the way that we interact with information, the promise of blockchain is really intended to replace traditional trust agents. If you think of banks, stock exchanges, law firms, escrow agents, title agents. These are all entities that ensure the proper handling of data or of documents. So blockchain is like a trust network. So for example, a person could easily get into real estate title files and change boundary lines to their advantage. Well, this could never happen with blockchain because the blocks are both transparent and immutable. Everybody can see them or needs to see them, and you can't really change any transaction without everybody else knowing. So this is the hype curve that Gartner likes to trot out from time to time. Honestly, I think we're blockchain halfway up the peak of inflated expectations. But as Steve Banker said from ARC, we'll know the technology when people don't use the term blockchain. They'll look at the results. In the same way that people don't use the term TCP/IP when talking about the internet. It's just the way it works. So, but everybody, I think, who's participating in supply chain blockchain potential really see the same benefits. One is secure, streamlined data flows. So if you imagine EDI served this purpose for many years, the movement of data from one trading partner to another, but EDI still has a hub that has to control it all. Blockchains are distributed. Smart contracts. If you think of Adobe contracts, if you've ever gotten a contract sent by someone you're trying to do an agreement with, and it comes through where you can click, and that data is stored in Adobe Vault. Smart contracts are kind of like that, except that there's no hub like Adobe. It's in the chain. Payments obviously could be executed as a term of the smart contract. Visibility, everybody can see, everybody in the chain can see what's going on as shipments move through the supply chain. Of course, compliance, it's very expensive to do carrier compliance. You've got to keep it updated, and particularly with Parcel, all the Parcel requirements tend to be proprietary. Well, blockchain could represent a new standard that would make it easier for entrants to engage in the industry. And so some of the major players like UPS, FedEx, DHL have decided to join an association, beta, to work out what the standards would be and the processes for blockchain. So it is getting some traction. It will obviously take some time to take hold. And Ken, want to wrap up?
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, so first of all, on behalf of both Bob and myself, I'd like to thank all of you that are joining us this afternoon, this morning, this evening, from wherever you are around the world. We hope that we've been able to provide you with our insight into what we feel are the 5 trends that we see impacting parcel transportation. We've all heard the saying about embrace change, and we both believe this should clearly be the direction that you should take to understand how your businesses will adapt to these emerging trends. We do have some time for some questions, and we'd actually love to hear from you back. So if I could turn it over to Amanda to raise a few questions for Bob and I, we'll take some now.
All right, sounds great. Thank you both so much, first of all, for a wonderful presentation. I thought that was extremely informative. And so now let's jump to the questions. The first one is, as shown in the presentation, most companies spend about 20 to 35% of their revenue on freight. Due to demand and inflation, will we ever see a point where retailers will no longer offer free shipping and pass the cost along to customers?
Bob, I'll give it a go first, and then you can jump in. But so I've got my consumer hat on first, and just for fun, I'm going to say I hope not. But no, but let's take a look at the question seriously, right? And I go back to the point that I was making at the beginning with respect to total landed cost of goods. We know that because we focused on the cost of manufacture and product and of the product, that we are now seeing that focus is on that second part of the equation. So we are, from a company perspective, trying to push down those costs, right? So that has to be the focus, but how far can we push them down so that they're at the bottom with respect to we're now starting to lose money? Now, I look at it from the perspective of how Bob opened up the presentation when he talked about Amazon is actually seeing this as so strategic that they're very aware that they're losing money with respect to the cost of distribution. And they're using it as a key part of their strategies to actually acquire market share, right? So I think I kind of look at this and say time will tell, but in the end, I think we're all going to have to be cognizant of it, and I think we'll see a point where it'll get to a bottom where there's no other choice than to actually have the consumer pay a portion of that with respect to getting the products to them in the way that they want. I think will be a key factor here. Bob, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd say that Amazon obviously is, we tried to show in this presentation, are really setting the terms for e-commerce, setting expectations for consumers. And so long as they're saying that shipping is free, then everybody else would really be forced to follow suit. But I would say one of the things that are coming through the surveys of consumer preferences, it's clear that consumers want choice. So it may not be, you're either paying for shipping or you're not. It may be that you're paying for certain kinds of shipping, next day, same day, but some are standard. Now, you're seeing this on some websites, but there may be incentives. We'll knock $1 off the price if you go pick up the shipment at a store. Again, because of the economies of consolidated delivery bode well for the shipper. So I'd say, if anything, choice is going to drive the price equation.
Yeah, I think also I'd add, Bob, here that the type of product also dictates the strategy here, right? So higher value products where consumers are paying that extra amount for the product has a tendency to have less of a dependency on the distribution cost than, if you like, lower priced products.
Yep.
Amanda, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. We have some great ones here. So the next one is, are you seeing trends in moving more toward private fleet versus third-party carriers for parcel shipments?
Yeah, I think I might have mentioned that a lot of the retailers are moving towards contract drivers, which are, I guess you could call them a semi-private fleet. But Target just acquired a company called Shipped and Grand Junction, and they're using those companies as kind of a private fleet for same-day delivery. And I think we can see other retailers will have to follow suit.
Right. I've got an example, Bob, in Europe where, one of my previous clients in another company that at peak, they're a large e-commerce company, but at peak they're doing 80,000 shipments an hour. And one of their big concerns is they just don't have enough means of distribution for that last mile. So they're investigating new methods of doing their product distribution, and they've actually started to create arrangements with even the pizza companies with respect to anybody who's doing some form of delivery within their key markets that has to become a strategic partner for them in order to be able to keep up with the demand that they're seeing.
Yeah, one of the analysts that I spoke with said, all these group-sourced delivery mechanisms or employees of Walmart going out and delivering into people's homes, at the end of the day, there has to be being true to the delivery promise. And if you can't, create a standard operating procedure around meeting that promise, it's awfully hard to maintain your brand.
I agree. Thank you both very much for your thoughts on that. The next question is, what was the source of the freight as a percentage of sales data? I know Amazon was mentioned at 12% and others were north of 20%. I guess the big question is, are there benchmarks out there for this data?
Yeah, the source of the data on Amazon was from their annual report. Take outbound transportation as a percentage of their revenue, and voila, you get to 12%. And then, depending upon the size and scale of businesses, obviously it's all over the board in terms of how other retailers and how other e-merchants are competing in terms of keeping that cost of delivery as a percentage of revenue down.
Okay, great. Let's see, the next question is, can you please clarify what department costs are included in the cost of distribution?
So that's a good question. I brought that one up at the beginning of the presentation when we were talking about the total landed cost of goods. And it varies based on the industry, but it also varies based on company and distribution model. Very simply put, if you look at it from the perspective of cost of manufacture, from the point of origin of manufacture to the point that where it reaches the consumer or end destination customer, the costs involved with the movement of the goods from A to B, as I've just described, are all included in the cost of distribution. And it could be anything from warehouse handling fees to the actual carrier fees, all inclusive. So that's when I said that, you're seeing companies that are focusing in this area now to reduce their total cost, which means you're seeing a resurgence in new technologies around warehouse management systems, transportation management systems, and including parcel management systems like we're talking about today. More and more of these solutions being offered in the cloud as a methodology to reduce the total cost of ownership. So depending on the company and depending on the distribution footprint, it could be quite significant.
Yeah, I'm going to have to now think about, go into my memory banks and remember what the CSCMP state of logistics statistics revealed, which was, I think, as a percentage of GDP, logistics is about 60%.
Yep. Yeah, I remember
so
that too, Bob.
I think that may mean what, it's what you may mean by, distribution costs, where I think transportation was about 13% of GDP. I have to look at it. I'll circulate the answer to that later.
All right, the next question we have is, this presentation seems slightly geared toward retail shippers. What about the rest of us? Are there different trends and principles that apply towards the non-retail shippers?
Well, we kind of talked about this a bit in Omni-Channel. So Omni-Channel doesn't necessarily reflect retailers alone. And I gave two examples that were in manufacturing, but there are many more. And the key thing is that, when you're looking at parts distribution, when you're looking at the aspects of more frequent shipments between different distribution centers, the frequency is changing it. So we're even seeing the similar trends around Omni-Channel impacting manufacturing world, where they're moving goods in and around their different manufacturing centers. So it all seems to be impacted based on the size of the goods that are being moved. So one of the examples I gave was Electrolux here, where they've actually analyzed their entire parts inventory and determined which parts now can fit into the Omni-Channel model, where they can reduce their inventory footprint, manufacture the parts on demand, right, therefore reducing costs, and therefore manufacture those parts closer to either their repair centers and or the engineers in the field. So that's just one example in manufacturing, but the automotive one with respect to the parts distribution centers of trying to get access from automotive manufacturers to get closer access to the consumer. So we are seeing many of these trends impacting other industries, although obviously based on consumer spend, retail is absolutely the biggest.
Yeah, I think the trend, Ken, I think you'd agree, is where retail was taking out the middleman from it, to direct the consumer. We're seeing, disintermediation of supply chain partners,
right,
just because of the availability of ordering online.
All right, sounds great. So the next one is, this year again, UPS and FedEx were at capacity during the holiday season, which badly affected service levels for the retail giants. What trends, in your opinion, can we expect to see in the future to alleviate this issue?
Well, I would just say more carriers and more carrier services. That's a trend that we tried to point out in the presentation, is that as TMS developers, we're seeing customers ask for more and more services to be supported within the platform. If for no other reason, they see that UPS and FedEx are at capacity, and it represents a risk to the business, particularly during the holiday rush. And I would also point out that UPS and FedEx have been less hostile to multi-carrier system providers, because they recognize that no one carrier can handle all the different services that consumers and B2B businesses now require.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question is, what technologies are you seeing developed to handle the optimization of carrier selection in regards to the evolution of crowdsourcing delivery options versus traditional delivery options?
I know Bob and I are both going to have some good comments on this one, but maybe I can start and kind of paint a picture from a multinational perspective for a moment, and then Bob and I can then throw in some joint comments. But one of the things that I find in working in the international space is that one of the bigger anomalies here is actually the U.S. market over everybody else. So to give you an idea, from a technology system that actually is looking to optimize here in the U.S. typically is impacted by price first, and I'll let Bob jump in a moment, but that's primarily because of the oligopoly of the three major players of FedEx, UPS, and the Postal Service. But outside of the U.S. market, you're seeing that the first and foremost request for optimization comes on which carriers have the ability to make it to the market that I'm distributing to. So if we're dealing in Europe, we have many, many more carriers that we have to deal with, for example, and so making sure that we select the ones that are able to get it there first and what the service levels are the two primary optimization characteristics, and then adding into price. So there's one of the things that we see that are driving a difference on how to do business internationally versus what you might see here in the domestic market. Now, I think when you add in now what we're seeing with the evolution of crowdsourcing and more delivery options, I think you'll actually start to see the U.S. domestic market look much more similar to the international market in taking a look at all three of the particular elements that I just described, which is who can get it there, because not all of the crowdsourcing delivery options can make it on a national basis. What kind of service quality will they offer with respect to service delivery guarantees and the delivery methodologies? And then, obviously, the price factor that's in there. So I think it'll be a combination of all three, although the U.S. domestic market has been primarily dominated on price for the last several years, or that I can think of. Bob?
Yeah, I think when I hear the word optimization, I always think of freight. I think of consolidating loads, determining, what the best ship from points are, how to get the least, cost per pound by shifting modes from parcel to LTL and LTL to truckload. I think with parcel and with more frequent and smaller shipments that have to get there in a half an hour, with by drone or next day, you don't really have the luxury of being able to look more strategically at how to consolidate or how to optimize loads. I think it's more of a transaction by transaction decision based on applying rules based on delivery requirement and level of service and so forth. So, and of course price, customer preference, and other factors. So it's much more dynamic to optimize parcel.
Regarding blockchain, what is your opinion on how carrier compliance will change with it?
That's a really great question. I think the carrier compliance requirements are that we've all kind of learned to live with, and essentially have made a living, providing compliance for, are pretty well entrenched. I really don't see blockchain dislocating those anytime soon, because to a large degree the compliance rules and compliance requirements kind of create a moat around the major carriers, right? It's hard for newbies, new services to come in and capture volume, because they have integration, they have to develop APIs, it's very expensive. So where I see blockchain really taking root is providing standards for all the carriers that are emerging that really don't have they don't have the time or the capability to build out the IT infrastructure. So long as there's a standard, it would be easier for smaller, more, I suppose, nimble carrier entrants into the market to adopt the blockchain standard. Kind of like third world countries that didn't have to kind of go down the road of putting copper in place for communication, copper lines, underground lines. They went immediately to wireless, and were able to be up and running much faster because because it was a standard that didn't require sort of them to slog through the copper era. I see the same thing for blockchain.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is, does the 12% freight spend of revenue for Amazon also include the revenue generated on Amazon's other ventures, such as cloud computing?
No. The 12% is based on $16 billion in outbound shipping costs against $135 billion in revenue, and those are 2016 numbers. So it doesn't include revenue. It doesn't include the cost of any of the other services that they provide. In thinking back towards one of the previous questions, the $16 billion doesn't include other logistics costs related to delivery. It's just really what is the cost of transportation, and that's it.
All right, thank you. Okay, this last question, our final question for today is, which of these trends will have the most lasting and significant impact on the way we ship parcels, and which of these trends should be prioritized?
Yeah, I think blockchain has the promise of having the biggest impact. Someone has said it's going to be a $500 billion industry for supply chain in years to come. But I think it's long term. It probably has the biggest impact. But I would say the things that you should prioritize, I would say, has to do with analytics, where you've got to understand what your costs are, which means collecting them from all the points at which shipping occurs, particularly in an Omni-Channel environment, and then understanding how do those costs compare to industry benchmarks. If you consider that you probably negotiate carrier contracts once every 2 or 3 years, carriers do it every year, you're probably at a disadvantage unless you know what your spend is and how you're spending it. And you can't really do that very well without even a basic analytics platform in place. Ken, I think you made that point.
Yeah, I agree, Bob. I was thinking, as we came together to actually do this presentation for today, I don't think we had the intention of doing it, but realizing that each of the trends that we identified build upon each other. So, we're focused really on reducing the cost of distribution, know what your costs are, and as you've pointed out, to do that, you've got to have the data to be able to determine what you can do to increase the performance of your supply chain, but also reduce the cost. So I look at it and I think that the underlying thing will always be driven towards our consumers, the people we're trying to provide our goods to, and then on top of that, then therefore reduce our cost to be able to provide that service. And so ultimately, the one that has the better data to make the better decisions wins. So I would agree with you. I think analytics is, if I have to pick one, that would be the one.
Yeah, I think I think we also made the point we were talking together is, if you don't know what your costs are and you don't know how your costs compare with your competitors, your transportation costs, you're kind of starting out, at the low end of a very steep hill that has to be climbed anyway. You might as well try to assure yourself that you're getting the best value for your volume and your shipping patterns.
All right, well, thank you both so much again for a wonderful presentation. Thank you to all of our attendees. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to attend this. And once again, thank you to PureBridge and Logistics Technologies for sponsoring this webinar. And just a reminder to all of our attendees, once again, you can access this at any time during the next year. So we hope you found this helpful, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.